I was in the garage installing a new backup battery for my whole house generator when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking on pavement, heading straight toward my driveway. Living in Meadowbrook Estates in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, you learn to recognize certain sounds, and the sharp staccato of expensive shoes paired with purposeful stride usually meant one thing: trouble from the HOA board. I wiped the grease off my hands and glanced up just as Patricia Henderson, our neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of property values and president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, rounded the corner of my house with her phone already raised, ready to document whatever imaginary violation she'd invented this week. "Ethan Brennan," she called out, her voice dripping with that false sweetness that made my teeth hurt. "I need to speak with you about that generator." I stood up from where I'd been crouched beside the unit, feeling my lower back protest after 40 minutes in an awkward position. The generator wasn't new. I'd installed it 3 years ago after a particularly brutal monsoon season knocked out power to half of Phoenix for nearly a week. The HOA had tried to stop me then too, claiming it violated some aesthetic clause in our community covenants. But my lawyer had quickly pointed out that Arizona state law specifically protected homeowners' rights to install backup power systems, especially in areas prone to extreme weather emergencies. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Patricia had been gunning for me ever since I'd successfully fought the HOA's attempt to fine me for parking my work truck in my own driveway overnight. I ran a successful electrical contracting business, and apparently commercial vehicles were beneath the dignity of Meadowbrook Estates. Never mind that it was a clean, well-maintained truck worth more than half the sedans parked along our street. She pursed her lips, her blonde highlights catching the afternoon sun. "We've received complaints about the noise level. According to Section 14.7 of our community guidelines, no homeowner shall create or maintain a nuisance that disturbs the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties." I gestured toward the silent generator. "It's not even running." "But when it does run," she continued without missing a beat, "it creates an unacceptable disturbance. I'm here to formally notify you that the board will be discussing this matter at our next meeting." This was classic Patricia. She couldn't force me to remove the generator because of state law, so she was trying to regulate when and how I could use it. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper would only give her ammunition. "The generator only runs during power outages, or during its monthly maintenance cycle, which lasts exactly 15 minutes and happens at 2 in the afternoon on the first Saturday of each month. I specifically chose that time because most people are out running errands. It's well within the acceptable noise limits set by Phoenix City ordinances." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll see what the board has to say about that." She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, but not before taking several photos of both my generator and my truck. My neighbor, Dale Mitchell, watched the whole exchange from his yard next door. Once Patricia was out of earshot, he walked over to the fence separating our properties. "She's really got it out for you," Dale observed, shaking his head. "Ever since you won that truck dispute, she's been looking for ways to nail you on something." "I'm not worried," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. Patricia Henderson had been HOA president for 6 years, and she'd made an art form out of harassment. She'd forced the Johnsons to repaint their house 3 times before approving the color. She'd filed formal complaints against the Ramirez family for having too many cars, even though they only had 4 vehicles for a household of 6 adults. She'd even tried to ban children from playing in their own front yards, claiming it created visual clutter. The woman was a nightmare in designer shoes, but she was also shrewd. She knew exactly how far she could push before crossing into legally actionable territory, and she had enough allies on the HOA board to make life miserable for anyone who challenged her authority. That night, I pulled out my copy of the CC and Articus, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed our neighborhood. I'd read through them so many times over the past few years that certain sections were practically memorized. There was nothing in the documents that could reasonably be interpreted to ban or restrict the use of a legally installed backup generator. But I also knew that wouldn't stop Patricia from trying. The next morning, I woke up to find a formal notice taped to my front door. The HOA board was holding an emergency meeting that evening to discuss ongoing violations of community standards by residents who consistently prioritize personal convenience over neighborhood harmony. I didn't need a decoder ring to know they were talking about me. I called my lawyer, Marcus Webb, who'd handled the previous dispute with the HOA. He listened to my summary of the situation and let out a long sigh. "They really don't learn, do they?" Marcus said. "Look, you're protected by state law on this one, but attending the meeting wouldn't hurt. Let them say their piece, stay calm, and then remind them about the relevant statutes. And Ethan, record everything. Arizona is a one-party consent state, so you're legally covered." That evening, I walked into the community center with my phone recording in my shirt pocket. The meeting room was set up with the 5 board members seated behind a long table at the front, with folding chairs arranged in rows for residents. About 20 people had shown up, more than usual. Patricia had clearly been drumming up support. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her prepared remarks. "We're here tonight to address a growing problem in our community. Some residents seem to think that rules don't apply to them. They install equipment that creates noise pollution. They park commercial vehicles in residential driveways. They show a complete disregard for the property values and quality of life of their neighbors." Several heads nodded in agreement. I recognized most of them as Patricia's regular supporters, the same people who showed up to every meeting to rubber stamp whatever she proposed. Specifically, Patricia continued, "We need to address the generator situation. Mr. Brennan has installed industrial equipment on his property that runs at all hours, creating a disturbance for everyone within earshot." I raised my hand. "Point of order. The generator only runs during power outages, which are emergencies, or during a 15-minute monthly maintenance window. It does not run at all hours." Patricia ignored me and continued reading from her notes. "The board proposes an amendment to our noise regulations that would prohibit the operation of backup generators between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m., and would limit daytime operation to no more than 30 minutes per month." "That defeats the entire purpose of a backup generator," I said, no longer bothering to raise my hand. "The whole point is to have power during outages, which don't schedule themselves around your preferred quiet hours." "If you'd like to make a formal statement, Mr. Brennan, you'll have an opportunity during the public comment period," Patricia said coldly. The board went through the rest of their agenda, mostly rubber stamping Patricia's various proposals, including a new fine structure for violations that started at $500 and increased exponentially for repeat offenses. When we finally reached the public comment section, I stood up. "Arizona Revised Statute 44-138.03 specifically prohibits HOAs from banning or restricting backup power systems," I said clearly. "Any attempt to regulate the use of my generator in a way that makes it effectively useless would violate state law. I'd really prefer not to involve lawyers again, but I will if necessary." Patricia's smile was razor thin. "We're not banning generators, Mr. Brennan. We're simply implementing reasonable noise restrictions to protect the community. Restrictions that would prevent the generator from operating during most power outages," I countered. "That's effectively a ban." The debate went back and forth for another 20 minutes with other residents chiming in. Some supported Patricia, mostly complaining about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Others, particularly those who remembered the week-long power outage 3 years ago, spoke up in support of the right to have backup power. Finally, Patricia called for a vote on the proposed generator restrictions. The vote was 3-2 in favor, with Patricia and her two closest allies, Sharon Montgomery and Carl Peterson, voting yes. The two newer board members, who seemed less enthralled with Patricia's authoritarian tendencies, voted no. I left the meeting angry but not surprised. Marcus had already warned me that the HOA would likely pass the restriction, and that we'd probably have to take legal action to have it overturned. It was going to be expensive and time-consuming, but I wasn't about to let Patricia Henderson dictate whether I could keep my family safe during emergencies. 2 days later, the forecast changed everything. The National Weather Service issued warnings about a massive storm system moving across the southwest. Not a regular monsoon, but a serious weather event with straight-line winds potentially exceeding 70 miles per hour, heavy rain, and widespread power outages expected. Phoenix utilities were already warning residents to prepare for extended outages. I spent the afternoon making sure the generator was ready, checking fuel levels, testing the automatic transfer switch, and securing anything in my yard that might become a projectile in high winds. My wife Sarah was out of town visiting her sister in San Diego with our 2 kids, and I was glad they'd be well away from the storm. The storm hit around 8 p.m. The wind came first, rattling windows and sending trash cans tumbling down the street. Then the rain arrived in sheets, so thick I could barely see the house across the street. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died. All up and down the block, houses went dark, all except mine. After a 3-second delay, my generator kicked in with a reassuring rumble, and my lights came back on. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see my house was the only one on the entire street with power. I was in the kitchen making coffee, grateful for my functioning appliances, when I saw a light bobbing in my backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, and that's when I discovered Patricia Henderson crouched beside my generator in the pouring rain, trying to plug an extension cord into one of the outlet panels on the unit. "What are you doing?" I shouted over the sound of the storm. She jumped, nearly dropping her flashlight. Her hair was plastered to her head and her expensive athleisure outfit was soaked through. "My power is out," she said, as if that explained everything. "I need to plug in some essentials." "You can't just help yourself to my power," I said, incredulous. "Don't be ridiculous, Ethan. We're neighbors. Neighbors help each other during emergencies." She went back to trying to connect her extension cord, which I now saw snaking across both our yards, running from her back door to my generator. "You spent the last week trying to make it illegal for me to run this generator," I pointed out. "You voted to fine me if I used it during evening hours, which is right now, and now you want to use the power it's generating." "That's completely different," Patricia said, not even looking up. "This is an emergency." The sheer audacity left me momentarily speechless. This woman had made my life difficult for years. She tried to fine me, restrict me, and regulate me into compliance with her vision of neighborhood perfection. And now, the moment she needed something, all of that went out the window. "No," I said firmly. "You can't use my generator. She finally stopped fiddling with the cord and stood up to face me, rain streaming down her face. I have medication that needs refrigeration. I have food that will spoil. You're being incredibly selfish. I'm being selfish. I couldn't help but laugh. You literally voted 2 days ago to prevent me from using this generator at night. You said it was a nuisance and a disturbance to the neighborhood. But now you want to benefit from it. Fine, she snapped. I'll pay you. How much do you want? It's not about money, Patricia. It's about you thinking the rules apply to everyone but you. You've been harassing me for 3 years, and now you show up in my yard in the middle of a storm and just help yourself to my property. She changed tactics, her voice softening into that pleading tone that probably worked on service workers and store managers. Please, Ethan. I really do have medication that needs to stay cold. I'm not trying to power my whole house, just a small refrigerator and maybe a light or two. For a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. Then I remembered the Johnson family repainting their house 3 times at a cost of thousands of dollars. I remembered Patricia trying to force the Ramirez family to get rid of one of their cars. I remembered every petty, vindictive thing she'd done to maintain her iron grip on this neighborhood. You should have thought about that before voting to restrict my generator usage, I said. The answer is no. Patricia's expression hardened. You're going to regret this. She reached down to plug in the extension cord anyway, moving quickly like she thought she could just connect it before I could stop her. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed the extension cord and pulled it away from the generator outlet. She held on, and for a surreal moment, we were engaged in a tug of war over an orange extension cord in the middle of a thunderstorm, both of us getting drenched, rain pouring down our faces. Let go, Patricia shrieked. It's my generator, I shouted back. She yanked hard and I stumbled forward. That's when I made a decision. I pulled out my pocket knife, flipped it open, and cut the extension cord cleanly in half. Patricia stared at the severed cord in shock, water dripping from the cut ends. You just destroyed my property. You were trespassing and attempting to steal electricity, I countered. Get off my property. Now. For a moment I thought she might actually attack me. Her face went red, visible even in the dim light from my flashlight, and her hands balled into fists. But then she seemed to remember where she was, and the red faded to a pale, pinched look. The HOA will hear about this, she hissed. You just assaulted me and destroyed my property. I have security cameras, I said, pointing to the weather-proof camera mounted under my eave, its little red light blinking steadily. They recorded everything, including you trespassing and attempting to steal power from my generator. So please, file a complaint. I'd love to see how that plays out. She grabbed the severed end of her extension cord and stormed off into the rain, leaving a trail of angry footprints in my muddy lawn. I stood there for a moment, adrenaline still pumping, wondering if I'd just made a terrible mistake. Then I went inside, toweled off, and downloaded the security footage to 3 separate locations. If Patricia was going to make this a legal issue, I wanted to be prepared. The storm lasted through the night. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the damage was extensive. Trees were down all over the neighborhood, streets were flooded, and according to the news, over 200,000 homes in the Phoenix metro area were without power. The utility company was saying it could be 3 to 5 days before everyone was restored. My generator hummed along reliably, keeping my refrigerator running, my sump pump working, and my devices charged. I made coffee and breakfast, and I tried not to think about Patricia's threat. Around 10 in the morning, Dale knocked on my back door. His house was still dark, and he looked tired. Hey man, I hate to ask, but could I charge my phone? My wife needs to call her mom and both our phones are dead. Of course, I said immediately, ushering him inside. You want some coffee? I've got a fresh pot. Dale looked relieved. That would be amazing. We've got camping gear, so we're okay for food, but I was really missing hot coffee. While his phone charged and we drank coffee, Dale told me that word had already spread through the neighborhood about my confrontation with Patricia. Apparently, several neighbors had seen her trudging back to her house, soaking wet and clutching a cut extension cord, and the gossip mill had gone into overdrive. Most people think it's hilarious, Dale admitted. Patricia's been making everyone miserable for years. The idea of her trying to steal power from the guy she just tried to find for having a generator, that's some quality karma right there. I probably shouldn't have cut her cord, I said, feeling a twinge of guilt now that the anger had faded. Are you kidding? She was stealing from you. You had every right, Dale shook his head. I guarantee you she's over there right now figuring out how to spin this in her favor. He was right, of course. Around 2 that afternoon, I heard a knock on my front door. This time it wasn't Patricia but a Phoenix police officer. My stomach dropped. Can I help you, officer? The cop, a middle-aged guy with a patient expression, pulled out a notepad. I'm Officer Rodriguez. I received a report about vandalism and theft of electricity. A Patricia Henderson claims you destroyed her property and assaulted her last night. I'd been expecting this, but it still made my mouth go dry. She was trespassing on my property and attempting to steal power from my generator without permission. I have video footage of the entire incident. Officer Rodriguez's eyebrows went up. You have video? Yes, sir. My security system captured everything. Would you like to see it? He nodded, and I pulled up the footage on my laptop. We watched the whole scene play out. Patricia entering my yard without permission, attempting to plug into my generator, the argument, and finally, me cutting the extension cord after she refused to leave. When it finished, Officer Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Well, he said finally, this is pretty clear-cut. She was trespassing and attempting to take power without your consent. That's theft of services. You were within your rights to stop her. Relief flooded through me. So I'm not in trouble. No, if anything, Mrs. Henderson is lucky you're not pressing charges. He made some notes. I'll need to go talk to her now. Can you email me a copy of that footage? I sent him the video immediately, and he headed across the street to Patricia's house. Through my window, I watched their conversation. Even from a distance, I could see Patricia's animated gestures, her obvious agitation. Officer Rodriguez remained calm, showing her something on his phone, probably the video I just sent him. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, and when it was over, Patricia's shoulders were slumped in a way I'd never seen before. She looked defeated. Officer Rodriguez came back to my house briefly. Just so you know, I explained to Mrs. Henderson that she committed trespassing and attempted theft. I'm not filing charges because she's claiming she was in distress due to medication needs, but I warned her that any further incidents would result in arrest. You shouldn't have any more problems. Thank you, officer. After he left, I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 hours later, there was another knock on my door. This time it was Patricia, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face was free of her usual makeup, and she was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of her typical polished outfits. She looked human in a way I'd never seen before. "Can I talk to you?" she asked quietly. "Please." I considered telling her to leave, but something in her expression stopped me. She looked genuinely distressed, not angry or combative. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in. We sat in my living room, the sound of the generator a steady background hum. Patricia stared at her hands for a long moment before speaking. "I need to apologize," she said finally. "What I did last night was completely out of line. I had no right to enter your property or try to use your generator without permission." I waited, saying nothing. "I've been thinking a lot since the police officer left," she continued. "About the things he said, about the way I've been behaving, about a lot of things." She looked up at me, and I was startled to see tears in her eyes. "I know I haven't been fair to you. I know I've made your life difficult for no good reason." "Why?" I asked. "What did I ever do to you?" She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Nothing, absolutely nothing, that's the problem." She wiped at her eyes. "When my husband left me 4 years ago, I was devastated. I felt like I'd lost control of everything in my life. So I started controlling the only thing I could, this neighborhood. The HOA gave me power, gave me purpose. I could make decisions, enforce rules, make sure everything was perfect. By making everyone else miserable." "I know," she said miserably. "I know I went too far. I turned into exactly the kind of person I used to hate. And last night, when I tried to plug into your generator, I wasn't thinking about the hypocrisy or the rules or anything except that I was scared and powerless, and you had something I needed." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her that her sob story didn't excuse years of harassment. But another part of me, the part that had been raised to show compassion, recognized genuine remorse when I saw it. "I'm sorry about your husband," I said finally. "But Patricia, you've hurt a lot of people. The Johnsons spent thousands of dollars repainting their house because you kept rejecting perfectly reasonable colors. The Ramirez family almost had to sell one of their cars. You've been a tyrant." "I know," she whispered. "And I'm sorry. I'm going to try to do better. I'm going to start by recommending that the board rescind the generator restrictions. And I'm going to publicly apologize at the next HOA meeting for targeting you." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or dishonesty. But all I saw was a tired, sad woman who'd finally hit rock bottom and realized what she'd become. "Okay," I said. "I appreciate the apology. But Patricia, if you really want to make this right, you need to step down from the HOA board. You need to let someone else lead for a while. Take some time, focus on yourself, maybe see a therapist." She nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll submit my resignation this week." After Patricia left, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing what had just happened. The generator continued its steady rumble outside, a sound that had caused so much conflict, and that had ultimately forced a confrontation that might actually lead to positive change. The power came back on in my neighborhood after 2 days, about 36 hours sooner than most of the surrounding areas. Patricia kept her word and submitted her resignation from the HOA board the following Monday. At the next HOA meeting, which was surprisingly well attended, she stood up and made a public apology not just to me, but to everyone she'd wronged during her tenure as president. The Johnsons, the Ramirez family, and half a dozen other residents all received personal apologies. She recommended the board not only rescind the generator restrictions, but also review and revise several other overly restrictive rules she'd pushed through over the years. Then she quietly took a seat in the back of the room, no longer at the head table. The board elected a new president, a reasonable woman named Grace Forrester, who actually seemed interested in building community rather than controlling it. One of her first acts was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the HOA and to reimburse me for the legal fees I'd incurred fighting the previous disputes. In the weeks that followed, I noticed real changes in the neighborhood. The HOA meetings became less about enforcement and more about community improvement. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other. Several other residents approached me about installing their own backup generators, and I was happy to offer advice and even some free consulting work. Dale and his wife invited Sarah and me over for dinner one evening, and the conversation naturally turned to the storm and its aftermath. "You know what the wildest part is?" Dale said, refilling our wine glasses. "Patricia Henderson actually seems like a decent person now. I ran into her at the grocery store last week, and she was almost friendly. Asked about my kids, didn't mention property values once. She's been seeing a therapist," Dale's wife Jennifer added. "My friend Helen goes to the same practice." Apparently, Patricia's been dealing with a lot of issues from her divorce. She's really trying to work on herself. I felt a strange mix of emotions hearing that. Part of me was still angry about the years of harassment, but another part was glad that something good had come from our confrontation. Sometimes people need to hit bottom before they can start climbing back up. About 6 weeks after the storm, I was in my garage working on a project when Patricia walked up my driveway. I tensed automatically, old habits dying hard. "Relax," she said, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to complain about anything. I actually came to ask for your professional opinion." "My professional opinion?" she nodded. "I'm thinking about installing a generator of my own. After the storm, I realized you were absolutely right about the importance of backup power. I was wondering if you might be willing to recommend a system for my house, and maybe even do the installation if you have time. I'll pay your full commercial rate, of course." I stared at her for a moment, trying to determine if this was some kind of trick, but her expression was open and genuine. "Sure," I said finally. "I can take a look at your electrical panel and make some recommendations. When's good for you?" We scheduled a consultation for the following weekend, and I spent an hour walking Patricia through her options. She ended up choosing a system similar to mine, and I contracted the installation work. It felt surreal, working in Patricia Henderson's backyard, installing the very type of equipment she'd tried so hard to ban from the neighborhood. But it also felt like closure. Like we were finally moving past the conflict and into something resembling a normal neighbor relationship. The installation took 2 days, and Patricia was genuinely interested in learning about how the system worked. She asked intelligent questions and took notes. On the second day, while I was doing the final testing, she brought out lemonade and cookies. "I really am sorry for everything," she said as I finished the last connection. "I know I've said it before, but I want you to know I mean it. You were right to stand up to me. Someone needed to." "Water under the bridge," I said, and I was surprised to realize I meant it. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that you're trying to do better." That evening, when I got home and Sarah asked about my day, I told her the whole story. She listened quietly, then shook her head in amazement. "I never thought I'd see the day when Patricia Henderson apologized to anyone," Sarah said. "Let alone had you install a generator in her yard." "People can change," I said. "It doesn't happen often, but it can happen." A few months passed, and life in Meadowbrook Estates continued to improve. The new HOA board under Grace Forrester's leadership implemented several popular changes, including a community garden, regular neighborhood social events, and a more reasonable approach to architectural and landscaping standards. Property values actually increased, despite the more relaxed rules, because people actually wanted to live in a friendly community rather than a place that felt like a prison. Patricia stayed true to her word about stepping back from HOA leadership, but she did get involved in organizing the neighborhood social events. She turned out to have a real talent for party planning, and the annual Meadowbrook Estates Block Party was the best attended event in years. I even saw her laughing with the Ramirez family, admiring their new baby and asking about their oldest son's college plans. The Johnsons, who'd once talked about moving just to escape her harassment, were now among her supporters. One evening in late November, about 8 months after the storm, I was doing the monthly maintenance run on my generator when Patricia came over with a plate of homemade brownies. "Peace offering," she said with a smile. "Though I guess we're past needing peace offerings." "We are," I agreed, taking the plate. "Thanks for these. Sarah will be thrilled." We stood there for a moment, listening to the generator's steady hum. The same sound that had been such a point of contention now seemed almost comforting, a reminder of safety and preparedness. "You know," Patricia said thoughtfully, "I used to hate that sound. I told myself it was disruptive and unnecessary. But really, I just hated that you had something I couldn't control, that you'd stood up to me and won." "It must have been hard," I said, "showing up that night in the rain knowing I'd probably say no." "I was desperate," she admitted, "and I wasn't thinking clearly." When the police officer showed me that video footage, watching myself act like such an entitled fool, it was like seeing myself for the first time in years. I didn't like what I saw. "But you did something about it," I pointed out. "That takes courage." She smiled sadly. "Or it just takes hitting rock bottom hard enough that the only direction left is up." She glanced at the generator. "Anyway, I won't keep you. I just wanted to say thanks. For the installation, for accepting my apology, for giving me a chance to make things right." After she left, I thought about the strange journey our conflict had taken. From that first confrontation in my garage, through the contentious HOA meetings, to the storm and the extension cord incident, and finally, to this place of mutual respect and understanding. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when I'd been angry enough to do things I later questioned. But in the end, standing up for myself had been the right choice. Not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. Patricia had needed someone to say no to her, to hold up a mirror and show her what she'd become. That it had happened during a crisis, in the middle of a storm, over something as mundane as a generator, almost seemed fitting. Sometimes life's biggest lessons come from its most ordinary moments. The next scheduled test run of my generator was on a bright Saturday afternoon. I'd sent out a courtesy email to the neighborhood, as I always did, letting people know about the brief noise. When I started it up for the 15-minute maintenance cycle, I noticed several neighbors had come out to watch, including Patricia. She gave me a thumbs up from her yard, where her own generator sat ready for the next emergency. Dale waved from across the street. The Ramirez family's oldest son, who was interested in electrical engineering, came over to ask questions about how the automatic transfer switch worked. This was what a neighborhood should be, I thought. Not a place of rigid rules and petty enforcement, but a community where people looked out for each other, helped each other, and yes, sometimes disagreed with each other, but ultimately respected each other's rights and autonomy. That Christmas, Meadowbrook Estates held a holiday party in the community center. Patricia helped organize it, and the turnout was incredible. Families brought dishes to share. Kids ran around playing games, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt genuinely warm and welcoming. At one point in the evening, Grace Forrester, our new HOA president, clinked a glass to get everyone's attention. "I just want to say how grateful I am to be part of this community," Grace said. "This year has been one of real growth and change for Meadowbrook Estates. We've learned that strong communities aren't built on strict rules and enforcement, but on mutual respect and support. We've learned that sometimes the best thing we can do is step back and trust our neighbors to make good decisions for themselves." Several people applauded, and I saw Patricia smiling, though there was a bittersweet quality to her expression. It couldn't be easy, watching someone else lead the organization she'd controlled for so long, even if she knew it was for the best. Later, as Sarah and I were getting ready to leave, Patricia approached us. "I wanted to thank you both," she said, "for coming tonight, for being part of this community, and Ethan, for not holding a grudge. I know I gave you plenty of reasons to." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Sarah said warmly. "And you've really made the most of yours." As we walked home through the decorated streets of our neighborhood, I thought about how much had changed in just 1 year. The same generator that had been the source of so much conflict now stood as a symbol of preparedness and good sense. Several other homes on our street had installed their own systems, creating a more resilient community overall. The HOA, once a source of stress and frustration, had become an actual asset to the neighborhood under Grace's leadership. And Patricia Henderson, the woman who'd made so many people miserable with her need for control, had transformed into someone who actually contributed positively to community life. It hadn't been an easy journey, and it had taken a crisis to force the necessary changes. But standing in my driveway, looking at my peacefully humming generator under the soft glow of my Christmas lights, I felt grateful for how everything had turned out. Sometimes, I reflected, the most important thing you can do is stand your ground. Not out of stubbornness or pride, but because some principles are worth defending. The right to protect your family during emergencies. The right to use your own property as you see fit, within legal bounds. The right to say no when someone tries to take advantage of you, even if that person holds a position of authority. I'd stood my ground that night in the rain, when Patricia had tried to help herself to my generator power. I'd cut that extension cord not out of spite, but because allowing her to take what she wanted without permission would have validated her behavior and undermined everything I'd been fighting for. And in a strange way, cutting that cord had been the best thing I could have done for both of us. It had forced a confrontation that needed to happen. It had pushed Patricia to face consequences for her actions for perhaps the first time in years. And ultimately, it had started her on a path toward becoming a better person. The spring following that eventful storm brought its own tests. The weather forecasters were predicting another active monsoon season, with the possibility of more severe storms. But this time, Meadowbrook Estates was ready. Between my own generator and the 6 others that had been installed in the months since the last big outage, nearly a third of the neighborhood now had backup power capability. Grace organized a community preparedness workshop, and she asked me to lead a session on backup power systems. Patricia helped with the setup and logistics. It was a surreal experience, standing at the front of the community center, teaching my neighbors about generator safety and maintenance, while the woman who'd once tried to ban those same generators passed out informational handouts. During the question and answer session, someone asked about the conflict with the HOA over generator restrictions. "I think we all learned something important from that situation," I said carefully. "Sometimes rules that seem reasonable on paper don't account for real-world emergencies and needs. The best communities are flexible enough to adapt when those conflicts arise. And sometimes," Patricia added from the back of the room, "the people making the rules need to be reminded that they're not above them." I was wrong to try to restrict something that serves such an important safety function, and I'm glad I was called out on it. There was a moment of surprised silence, then someone started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the whole room was applauding. Not for me, I realized, but for Patricia's willingness to admit her mistakes publicly, and to support a change she'd once opposed. That monsoon season did bring more storms, though none quite as severe as the one that had started everything. Each time the power flickered and my generator kicked in, I thought about that night in the rain, about Patricia with her extension cord, about the choice I'd made to cut it rather than give in. I'd made the right call, not just for myself, but for my entire neighborhood. Sometimes standing up to unreasonable authority is uncomfortable. Sometimes it leads to conflict and confrontation. But sometimes it's exactly what needs to happen to create real, lasting change. As summer faded into fall, and we approached the one-year anniversary of the storm, Grace announced that the HOA would be hosting a special event to celebrate the neighborhood's growth and resilience. She called it the Meadowbrook Estates Community Appreciation Day, and it was designed to recognize residents who'd made significant contributions to improving neighborhood life. I didn't expect to be one of those residents, so I was surprised when Grace called me up to the front during the event's award ceremony. "Ethan Brennan represents the best of what it means to be a good neighbor," Grace said. "He stands up for what's right, he helps others when they need it, and he's never afraid to challenge authority when that authority oversteps its bounds. His willingness to fight for his rights ultimately led to positive changes that have benefited all of us." She handed me a plaque which felt both meaningful and slightly embarrassing, but what came next was even more unexpected. Patricia stood up and came to the front. "I'd like to add something," she said. "Ethan Brennan is the neighbor I needed, even when I didn't know I needed him. He showed me that being strong doesn't mean controlling others. It means standing firm in your principles while still leaving room for compassion and forgiveness. He could have pressed charges against me after I trespassed on his property. He could have made my life miserable in retaliation for years of harassment. Instead, he accepted my apology, gave me a chance to make things right, and even helped me install my own generator. That's the definition of a good neighbor." The applause this time was thunderous, and I found myself genuinely moved. I'd never sought recognition for what I'd done. I'd just been trying to protect my rights and my family. But hearing Patricia, of all people, publicly acknowledge how the conflict had led to positive change made the whole difficult experience feel worthwhile. In my brief acceptance speech, I kept it simple. "I think we all learned that a strong community isn't one where everyone follows the rules without question. It's one where people care enough to speak up when something's wrong, and wise enough to listen when they are the ones who need to change. Thanks to all of you for making Meadowbrook Estates a place where that kind of growth is possible." That evening, as the party wound down and neighbors drifted home in the twilight, Patricia caught up with me in the parking lot. "I never properly apologized for cutting your extension cord," I said. "I could have handled that differently." She shook her head. "No, you couldn't have. I wasn't listening to words that night. I needed a dramatic wake-up call, and that's exactly what you gave me." She smiled. "Besides, it was a cheap extension cord. What I learned from the experience was priceless." We stood there for a moment in the fading light, two people who'd been at odds for years but had found their way to mutual respect. "You know what's funny?" Patricia said. "I used to lie awake at night thinking of ways to get you to leave the neighborhood. I saw you as this stubborn obstacle to my perfect vision of what Meadowbrook Estates should be. Now I can't imagine this place without you." "Life's funny that way," I agreed. "Sometimes the people who challenge us the most are exactly the people we need." As Sarah and I drove home that night, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, "for standing your ground when it mattered and for showing grace when that mattered too. You changed this neighborhood for the better." "We all changed it," I said. Patricia changed herself. Grace stepped up to lead. The other residents got more engaged. I just happened to be the catalyst. "Don't sell yourself short," Sarah said firmly. You were willing to be uncomfortable to fight for what was right even when it would have been easier to just go along. That matters. 2 years after the storm, Meadowbrook Estates had become one of the most desirable neighborhoods in our part of Phoenix. Property values were up, community satisfaction was high, and the HOA had won awards for innovative community programming. Patricia had taken on a role organizing community service projects, channeling her organizational skills and energy into genuinely helpful work. She'd partnered with Dale to create a neighborhood watch program that focused on helping elderly residents with yard work and home maintenance. My generator still hummed reliably through its monthly test cycles, and during the occasional power outage, it kept my family safe and comfortable. But more than that, it stood as a reminder of an important lesson: that standing up for yourself matters, that authority should always be questioned when it overreaches, and that even the most difficult conflicts can lead to positive change if everyone involved is willing to grow. The extension cord incident had become something of a neighborhood legend. New residents would hear the story and laugh at the image of the HOA president trying to steal power from the very generator she'd tried to ban. But those of us who'd lived through it understood that it represented something deeper. The moment when one person's unreasonable exercise of authority finally met immovable resistance, and how that collision had ultimately made everyone better. I never regretted cutting that cord. It was a decisive action in a moment that required decisiveness. It had consequences, certainly, but they were consequences that needed to happen. Patricia needed to face the reality of her behavior. The neighborhood needed to see that the HOA wasn't all-powerful. And I needed to prove to myself that I wouldn't be bullied or taken advantage of, no matter who was doing the bullying. Looking back now, I can see how every step of that journey was necessary. The initial conflicts over my truck and generator established the pattern. The HOA meeting where they tried to pass restrictions showed how far Patricia was willing to go. The storm created the crisis that brought everything to a head, and my decision to cut that extension cord, while dramatic, was the catalyst that finally forced real change. Sometimes we look for complex solutions to complicated problems. We want nuanced approaches, diplomatic resolutions, win-win scenarios. But sometimes the answer is beautifully simple. Say no. Stand your ground. Cut the cord, literally or metaphorically, that ties you to an unhealthy situation. And then, crucially, leave room for what comes next. If I'd been vindictive or cruel in my victory, Patricia might never have found the motivation to change. If I'd refused her apology or held a permanent grudge, we'd have missed the opportunity to build something better. The key was being firm in the moment while remaining open to growth and change afterward. That balance is what transformed our neighborhood. It's what turned an antagonistic relationship into a respectful one. And it's what allowed a community that had been suffocating under rigid control to breathe freely and flourish. 3 years on, I still run into people at the grocery store or the gas station who tell me they heard about the generator incident. Some laugh about it. Others want to share their own stories of dealing with unreasonable HOAs or petty tyrants in their communities. And I always tell them the same thing. Stand your ground, document everything, know your rights, and never let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what's yours. But I also tell them about the afterward, about Patricia's transformation, about how the neighborhood came together, about how conflict, handled correctly, can be the start of something better. Because that's the part of the story that matters most. Not the dramatic confrontation in the rain, but the slow, steady work of building a better community in its aftermath. My generator still sits beside my house, a quiet sentinel ready for the next emergency. but now it's more than just a piece of equipment. It's a symbol of resilience, both electrical and personal. It's a reminder that preparation matters, that standing up for your rights matters, and that even the most difficult neighbors can find redemption if given the chance. And somewhere across the street, Patricia Henderson's own generator sits ready, a mirror image of mine. Two systems, once a source of bitter conflict, now standing as testaments to how far we've all come. Every month when I run my maintenance cycle, I see her do the same. We wave to each other across our yards, two neighbors who learned hard lessons and came out better for it. That's the real story in the end. Not about a generator or an extension cord or even about an HOA power struggle. It's about people learning to respect each other's boundaries, to acknowledge their mistakes, and to build something better from the ashes of conflict. It's about how a single decisive action on a stormy night can set in motion changes that transform an entire community. And it's about understanding that sometimes, when someone tries to take what's yours without asking, the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to cut the cord and force a reckoning. Because only in facing the consequences of our actions can we truly grow into better versions of ourselves. Meadowbrook Estates isn't perfect now. No place is. We still have disagreements, still have conflicts, still have neighbors who occasionally annoy each other. But we have something we didn't have before, a culture of mutual respect, open communication, and genuine community. We have an HOA that serves the residents rather than controlling them. And we have the shared understanding that we're all in this together, that we rise and fall as a community, and that looking out for each other doesn't mean letting others take advantage of us. The generator that started it all continues its faithful service, ready for whatever storms may come. And I'm ready too, secure in the knowledge that I can protect my family, stand my ground when necessary, and still be part of a neighborhood that values both individual rights and collective well-being. That's not just good policy. That's the foundation of a life well lived and a community worth being part of.